back to the Kingsway Podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. I almost slammed the table right there. That would have just thrown this whole thing off so bad. Hey, thanks so much for getting back. I hope that you have been following our Chosen reviews. I know we put those out a few weeks in a row. We're now on episode, I think, 7. They just finished 6. Those are really fun. Yes. And I just finished the episode 7 of season 2. I can just say this is going to be a fun journey, and I'm excited to continue that. We have a special episode today. We got Mr. John Coward back on the show.
Glad to be here.
Glad you're here. And then Mr. Ryan has a specific thing that we have him for that he's going to outline in just a second. But before we get there, 2 quick things. If you're listening to this podcast, our children's camp is filling up quick. Children's and junior high. So full. And so if you are listening to this and you're a parent of a kid like kindergarten to 7th grade, 8th grade, stop what you're doing and go sign up your kids if you want them in, because it may already be full. Mm-hmm. I know that it is close. They had, I think, 78 people signed up.
Depending on the grade, there are 3 or 4 slots. I think junior high has a little bit more.
Yeah, it is filling up really fast. So just keep that in mind as you're listening. We want to keep you up to date. The other thing is, if you are coming on Sunday mornings, please do not miss kind of these next few sermons. We're going through the crucifixion of Jesus and kind of the ending of the Gospel of John. I think you will greatly be blessed. Either tune in on our YouTube channel right here, Sunday mornings at 10:15, or if we'd love to see you in person at Kingsway here in Mount Vernon. So if any other things you need to go, just go to kingswaymo.com. You can find some details or directions or answer any questions.
Yeah.
So,
but as you mentioned, Trevor, we are coming to the conclusion of our Gospel of John series on Sunday mornings, which means that, like you said, we're in the final steps, the final chapters in the book, in the Gospel account. So what that means for us is that we're coming to Jesus' crucifixion this week. So we're recording this on Wednesday. It's coming out Thursday. This Sunday is kind of Jesus' torture before his crucifixion and death. And so we're doing some special stuff on the Sunday services to help us focus in on that. But I thought for our podcast, why not take a moment? One of our most watched episodes was episode 50 about the atonement. We're a couple episodes away from that right now, but we always said we wanted to come back to it. This is the perfect time.
Yeah.
So this can kind of be a companion to Sunday mornings where we're going to talk about certain stuff and not about others because we have limited time. Mm-hmm. But here we have unlimited time. Kind of.
Well, and more voices. I think that's the fun thing, is not just hearing my voice. And on Sunday, it's not just going to be my voice either. And part of this is, we've talked about this morning when we had kind of our sermon kind of prep and review and kind of walk through meeting, trying to make sure that this isn't stale and that we don't just coast through this and not take time to really feel it. And so I think today's podcast is a perfect time we don't want to make it a downer, but at the same time, I think it is really important to notice the weight of what's going on in order to feel the depths of the joy that is to come.
Yeah.
And so that being said, I think it'd be good for you to introduce kind of what we're going to talk about today, Ryan, and maybe give a chance to maybe set up the discussion and conversation, because I'm in the dark, but I'm excited because I know just the bits and pieces that you've shared. It sounds like it'll be a fun discussion.
Yeah. This is going to be a great conversation that is improved by me turning off the air conditioner.
Oh, yeah, because it's super loud right now. I can hear it. I'm really proud of you.
I'm trying so hard.
Just turn it up.
Turn it up?
Yeah, just turn it up.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, just turn it up a bunch.
Let's get cooking in here.
There you go.
Okay.
There we go. Okay.
That fixed it.
Good. Perfect.
Sorry about that. Jesus' crucifixion. We talked about atonement theories on episode 50, like I said, and we covered ones that covered different lengths of Jesus' life and ministry, his divine life before his human life and after and all those things. But the one that really focuses in on the 3 days that we're talking about over the next couple weeks, 3, 4 something weeks, is the one that a lot of people know. It's called the Penal Substitutionary Atonement theory. It's the legal one. It's the sacrifice one. It's the in your place one. That is the one we're talking about. So over the next 2 weeks at least, we're going to cover different ways of looking at this. And so that's one reason we have John here today. John's a lawyer, which means he knows everything about the law. Nothing is hidden from his law brain.
Really?
Yep.
Okay, I'll put that on my website.
Put that in his resume.
Business card. I know everything.
Yeah, I know everything.
Anyway, we're going to cover some of the more legal side of this theory this week. We'll cover some of the more sacrificial side, the Jewish sacrificial system, next week.
That will be that's going to be a fun one too.
I'm
so excited because this side I think is more of the. This sounds like really maybe prideful, or maybe it can be a little painful for some, but this is probably the most elementary version of gospel understanding that I think is taught in its largest numbers in this area. This the substitution idea of like, this is what you owed, this is what's been paid, this is what you get now. If that makes sense, like this is what you earn. I think letting people hear that, like, you sinned, Jesus paid for it, now you get into heaven. You know, like that is like the simplest version.
That's how the gospel story has been cut, folded, and packaged to us.
Most commonly
in this area in the United States.
Yes, because we are in the Midwest, we're in Missouri, and let me be clear, it's not bad.
No,
it's not a bad way to hear it, and that's why we're taking the time to talk about it, because I think there's even depths to that that we haven't really unpacked. And that's
which is why I love the episode today.
Exactly.
That we're about to get into.
So it's so much more, but it is that. But it's so much more than that. If that makes sense.
But that's a key part of it. In the atonement episode, I talked about how there's all these different theories or theologies. That just means ways people have tried to summarize it.
Yeah.
They've taken an idea and tried to say, I think this idea holds all the pertinent information.
Yep.
So they've made it, but it's like drawing from the. Yeah. So this idea, the penal substitutionary atonement theory, is what a lot of people, especially for the past 500 years, have said is the major idea, of which you can draw in recapitulation, which is Jesus as the new Adam, which you can draw in Christus Victor, Jesus as the victorious conqueror over death. Like, you can fit all those into this main one. Some other people, like the guy in this book that I'm holding up, which you can definitely see on the audio version of this podcast. This is The Word Enfleshed by Oliver Crisp. If you ever want to go so deep into the study of who Jesus is and what he did, that your brain's going to start bleeding or something,
but
then
in
this
a great
is the book
way.
for that. It's only 150 pages, but every 3 pages you're going to have to stop and
take a breath,
take a breather. Anyway.
No, I think that's
can
powerful.
I ask a question real quick?
Go ahead.
Yes.
So I come into this, I haven't been to Bible school as much as you guys have. So, but my impression is that these different ideas of looking at the crucifixion are not necessarily mutually exclusive.
No.
Correct.
So you could totally buy into this penal substitution, and then you could buy into the union theory that we talked about.
Yep.
You could buy into the second Adam theory. So I think there are different ways. The way I look at it, there are different ways of looking at the same object, but from a different perspective, which I think is great.
Absolutely.
If you buy a diamond, it can reflect the light in a different way depending on how you
Same
turn
light,
it.
though.
And I think it's
Yeah.
kind of the
Same light.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's like when Jesus talks about money and tells a parable. He tells like 10 different ones. Don't fact check me. I'm pretty sure it's more. But he tells a bunch of different ones. None of those are the end all be all teaching on money. But they're all ways of trying to explain how humanity and money should work.
Yeah.
None of them are flawless, but they're all pretty good summaries.
I mean, it's in my mind, it's a non-concrete concept. So it's like describing love. There's many ways to describe what love is and how love looks and what you would do. I think this whole story, or this unwrapping of what salvation is, has to be a little bit, I think, in some ways, as we get older, as we gain understanding, as we read, as we, the morphs and changes. Just like when I got married to my wife at 20, I committed myself at 36. I am still committed, but I know the weight of what that commitment means.
Yeah. Right.
Some of this, I think, is growth in your Christian understanding of the covenant that you're now under with Christ. And I think that's incredibly helpful for people to know that, like, just because this is the most elementary starting place doesn't mean it's any less more powerful to, provide some of the answers that we're talking about in the sense of what Christ did when he went to the cross and when he came out of the grave, and how, union theory says it started at the garden, and it's like, this is where, so understanding that is healthy. Why I think you're here and why I want you to kind of, we're going to cut to the chase and kind of go, it's a few pages out of this book that I haven't even heard, but I'm excited to kind of set up the drama of, because I think there's a part of this that it's healthy to understand even the weight of this substitution idea inside this
Yeah.
needs to be understood not just in a certain way,
Yeah.
but can be kind of blown up and expanded. So let's take that and dissect that for a second.
Okay. So there's 2 or 3 things I want to hit. I'll start with the first one. So these are my notes from when I taught an atonement theories class. So there's a lot in this theory. Again, the theory is how men tried to understand what God was saying and tried to summarize it. There's a lot in this theory that was solidified at the Reformation. If you don't know what that is about year 1517 AD. The Catholic Church was one of like 2 or 3 major churches in the world. It's the Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, and maybe some little smaller groups beyond that. But those were pretty much the 2 top dogs.
Yep.
And if you're in the West at all,
Yep.
if you were Europe and Africa and the Middle East and West, that was the church. So Martin Luther really struggled with legalism, which is just like you have to do certain things to get God to be okay with you. And almost like magic, like a potion, like a formula. If I can just leverage God by doing these certain things, then he'll be happy with me and I'll get to go to heaven. And so Martin Luther was one of the guys who in 1517 did one of the first things. He nailed his 95 theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg. That's a whole
That's
that
a
could
whole
be-
other
that
animal.
could be 17 episodes right there.
Yep.
But that event sort of started the Reformation, and a lot of what he was doing was questioning some of the legalistic tendencies. And these legalistic tendencies, it was the church was pretty corrupt at that time. I want you to hear this. Anything I say about the Catholic Church right now does not apply to the Catholic Church down the street. A lot has happened in the past 500 years, and they do not resemble this church right here.
Yeah.
But a lot of people, their services and a lot of their stuff was in Latin. A lot of people couldn't read that. So they were just at the mercy of the priests and the bishops, the leaders of that church, of like, how do I know I'm okay? So they over hundreds of years made this theology that said, you need to do enough good stuff to earn enough points, basically, to not go to hell. And so there's a lot of threat against them, and you got to do this stuff to not be threatened.
There's a lot of fear.
Yeah.
A lot of fear. Very
So-
driven by fear.
One of those things was a thing called penance. I'm going to get out of the weeds to all this stuff in a
That's
second.
okay, dude. No, this is
Yeah.
healthy. And I know somebody's listening right now that they're very interested. So keep going.
Okay. But not you.
No, I am. I am.
Okay.
I just know it's an important subject. A lot
So-
of people have questions about it.
The Catholic Church, one of the things they used to threaten people was an idea called penance. You need to repent a certain amount or a certain number of times or a certain dollar amount in order for God to forgive you. And so 2 examples of that. One, during Martin Luther's day, one of the things that made him really upset is a statement that tax collectors, but church tax collectors, so like penance collectors, would say, they had this theology of a thing called purgatory, which is like a waiting room for heaven or hell. And if you're there, that's like your last chance to do enough penance or for somebody else to do enough penance to all
get you
this
out.
whole like
Yeah.
system of numbers.
None of
So
which
they
is in
would
the Bible.
say,
No.
no, not in the Bible. They would say every coin in the coffer in the collection plate rings another soul from purgatory springs.
Yep.
Keep giving and people keep getting saved by your money hitting the collection plate, which is super rough.
That's
Not
hard to
great.
hear.
That's the other thing that was really hard for Martin Luther to hear, and I think it's the thing he heard right before he
You
nailed
wrote
these,
the.
is somebody was going around, one of these collectors, and saying, pay this penance and it'll even forgive you if you violated the Mother Mary herself.
Yep.
Which is like, what? Where did
Yeah.
that, at what point? No, I didn't even know. It's so antagonistic, antithetical to Christianity, to our faith, to what Jesus looks like. And so Martin Luther kind of formulated the penal substitutionary atonement theory, not trying to make it more legalistic, but trying to say that Jesus' sacrifice is legally the only thing you need to be totally saved. And you need faith in him and trust in him and whatever, but you just need to lean on that instead of penance, prayers and confession.
And
to
Martin Luther's
certain
conversion pointed him to that, because Martin Luther was planning
Yeah.
to go to college, had this incredible experience where he was out in a field, lightning struck all around him, committed his life to the church. If God would spare him,
Yeah,
he came
again,
to faith
out of fear.
and then started learning Latin and started becoming a scribe. And he was reading different things.
We'll start learning Latin and Greek and
Yeah.
Hebrew.
And started all of a sudden putting these pieces together. And so the Bible was really what led him to this theory, too.
Yeah. So if you don't know,
The book of Romans.
the Bible
Particularly,
originally,
yes.
the people who wrote the Bible wrote it, the Old Testament in Hebrew, the New Testament in Greek. Latin is not a language that the Bible was written in.
It was, it was
but
translated.
like the church was kind of centered in Rome after about 300s, and Jesus died in maybe 33 AD. So about 300 years later, it became legal to be a Christian across the entire world, basically, because Rome held the entire world hostage.
Well, and it was more too that the most common language at the time that was understood and read was Latin
by 300.
by 300, and that's
Yeah.
why it transferred. Just similar to how our world would be English, but that's not.
So the Roman church was the church for a long time. Their language was Latin. That was 300 years too late for Hebrew and Greek. The New Testament being written in Greek and all that. So Martin Luther was learning what the church's language, and then separately was learning the Bible's language, and was seeing that they were not agreeing.
Yeah, gosh.
That there was a lot. So that's why that's important. I want to make sure everybody caught that. Anyway, so he kind of helped formulate this theory in the wake of a corrupt church trying to force people into fear to gain resources and power, and holding salvation over their heads.
Just awful.
And at that time, death was very present.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
the
Everybody's
plague.
life for
The
children.
Black
Yeah,
Plague was 100, 200 years
Well,
before that.
and they had, typhoid. There's all these
Yeah.
fevers, different things that were coming through.
Didn't have
And-
any,
no,
modern
they were still
medicine
bleeding.
or-
They
yeah,
were still,
very primitive
oh, gosh,
medical.
it was-
So death was a constant present in everybody's lives, for children, for young adults, for older people.
Well,
of
and
course.
then you
So-
had this uprising of suicides because a whole family would die except for one parent or one child or one relative, and then they would commit suicide, and suicide was seen in a different way in the Catholic Church, and so that was Martin
Yeah.
Luther had just these massive things where he just that was one of the things that led him to where he's just
Yeah.
going like, this is not right, we cannot.
yeah.
So the idea of what happens to you after this life here and in the afterlife was a much bigger concern, I think, for the average person
In a
15,
fear way.
17.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, for
It's
sure.
always been a big concern, but their concern was, did I get enough Jesus points
Right.
through? I'm looking at my notes now here, through purgatory, like getting around that, indulgences, and confession and different things. Did I do enough good stuff to outweigh the bad stuff? Or
Do
enough
more, do
stuff that
better,
God
do more,
likes?
do better, do more, do
Yeah.
better.
So Martin Luther made this theory. I'm trying to not go super long, but he made this theory because one of the things he was studying was the book of Romans, which is probably one of the more legal sounding books in the New Testament.
But it's not.
It's in prose. It's one of Paul's letters to the church in Rome, and it's got a lot of that kind of language. Anyway, one of the quotes, I think this is the one that actually convinced him. This is in chapter 1 of Romans, verse 16 and 17. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, and this is the part that stuck out to him, it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. He read that under the threat of damnation to hell by not having enough Jesus points, and he was like, wait, the gospel is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, and not penance and not confession, which confession's important.
Yeah.
But like the way they were doing it was like, you have to confess to a certain person in a certain way, do a certain number of prayers to get.
But if you think about it, that's why this worked, is because
Yeah.
if you had 4 relatives that died suddenly of a disease, didn't have a chance or an opportunity to go to confession, didn't have the money to pay the penance, and then all of a sudden they pass, and now you're trying to earn quadruple amounts of that to earn them into a place that
Yeah.
maybe they themselves. It was a horrible system that put a lot of people in a position constantly to be under the
Yeah.
thumb of fear and law and works. I mean, you
Yeah.
can just feel his own
Yeah.
tension in that.
So Martin Luther said that this scripture gave him a rebirth into a new way of living by faith and understanding the entirety of scripture and life. So that's why I thought that was important. That's kind of where this was born, the way we understand it today. it's definitely present in Scripture. It's not like we made it up, but this is where it's solidified into one thing.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the background of this. We don't want to be motivated by fear of random things. We want to be saved by God's power. Now, this is still a very legal theory, which, again, is why we have John here. John, can you give a quick background of, like, what kind of law you practice, etc.?
Well, first of all, I work in a small town, so you kind of
Yes.
have to do a little bit of everything, but mostly what I do is the civil side of things.
Yep.
So it's people that have been hurt in a car wreck, maybe hurt at work. I do a lot of that stuff. I look at a lot of medical records during most of my day.
Yeah.
So helping people navigate through that. People that have boundary line disputes, people
Yeah.
that have contractual issues involving purchase of property, people that my son does a lot of work with adoptions, with probate, how to handle property after you're gone. So a pretty broad spectrum
Yeah.
of what I do, and I've been practicing law now for, I hate to admit this, since 1985, so that's 36 years.
I was negative 10 years old when you started practicing.
I was one.
You didn't have to point
I was one.
You
We're
didn't
good.
have, neither one of us pointed that out. And but it's amazing how fast that goes.
Oh, yeah.
It's just incredible, and God has been very good to me. I look at myself, and I think people need to look at themselves this way, as an ordained lawyer. Okay, because what you do it all for the glory of God, and people see that in how you live your life Monday through Friday. So to me,
And that's possible. You're saying that's possible.
Yeah, even though I'm not trying, I'm probably getting off the track. Here,
No.
but what
I
wanted,
just want to
but-
make you.
But as an attorney is helping people navigate through some of the hardest parts of their lives. In particular, and I have done some criminal work in the past. In fact, I had a guy come up to me yesterday. I was at a guy's 90th birthday party that I know, and another friend of his came up to me and said, "I want to thank you for all the work you did for Aaron." And this was a young man I represented 10 years ago who became very intoxicated his first weekend at college and ended up being in an accident, causing an accident that killed another person.
Oh, man.
And he went through a very hard time of life. He ended up spending some time in prison, but we were able to work out a system where he was able to get out of prison. He actually had to talk to other like high school groups and stuff about his experience.
Yep.
And I talked, this was his uncle that was talking to me. He said he has so turned his life around. He's doing so well right now, and he's got his life together. And so it's good to see that maybe in some small way you help people through a situation like that. So that's a long explanation of what I do, but it involves a lot of different things.
What I think is cool about the podcast here and what we're going to get into in just a minute is I feel like you have a very pastoral approach to lawyer. Like you just have a natural to a law to being a lawyer. I think there's just a natural way that you're trying to do the best for the person, but also what you feel like is virtually the best thing. And I think virtue has a way of sifting into what you speak, how you talk to your clients.
Well, what you hope is, if you're filled with the Spirit and somebody bumps into you, that Spirit should spill a little bit.
Oh man, that's an A.W. Tozer quote. I forget what that's exactly. But
So I like A.W. Tozer, but it comes out. Even a friend of mine teases me. I had the last jury trial I did before COVID. I gave a closing argument, and in my closing argument, I talked about the book of Job and how God allowed Satan to inflict him with physical pain and what that's like and how difficult that is as a test for a person to go through. In fact, that's the most difficult thing Satan said. You took away his property, even his children, but let me go after him personally.
Yeah.
And we'll see if he still worships you, God, after we're done with this. So you can use that, and my friend's like quoting Job, and how do you do that in a closing argument? But that's just something that
flows out of you.
Flows out of you when you think about how God looks at life and how the Bible looks at life as well. It should inform you as how you live your life and your job.
I think it's just going to flow perfectly into this setup because I think you're going to have a chance to bring your opinion on this, but then also I think you're going to bring it into the church world because obviously you've been in part-time staff here at Kingsway for over a year, and I think there's a part that this is really going to connect those two worlds in a cool way. So I don't, if you want to
Yeah.
set up or what.
Yeah. So I read this when I was studying for this like 3 or 4 something years ago. I'm only going to read a section of this book, but again, this is a book, The Word Enfleshed by Oliver Crisp, and he's talking about this theory, this legal theory of the atonement, how God saved us in a legal kind of way, and he presents something that I'd never heard before, which I think touches on law and different kinds of law. So, Trevor, I'm going to give you permission. As I read this, you've never heard it before.
Never.
If you ever get confused or bored, just tap the table.
Tap the
And
table.
I'll stop and we'll figure it out. Because I don't want this to go on forever and be droning.
I'm going to pay attention to the best of my ability.
Full
There.
disclosure, I have read this, but
Focus.
just briefly.
Just briefly.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, you don't get that tap out
right.
then. No, I'm just kidding.
Right. It's all on you.
Here we go. So this kind of picks up mid-thought. I'll try to stop and explain if I can. There are, as philosopher David Lewis points out, definite analogs to penal substitution in human systems of justice. And in many ways, we humans are of two minds about penal substitution, irrespective of whether or not we believe in its theological application. Okay, here's where it kind of picks up. We allow it, the substitution, for a crime. We allow it under certain conditions for certain sorts of crimes, where the penal consequences, penal meaning punishment. I feel like I should say that instead of just saying penal 100 times. Okay, we allow it sometimes for certain sorts of crimes, where the penal consequences of the crime committed are pecuniary in nature, or like a debt
Yeah.
in nature.
A fine.
Yeah, so we allow that when there's a fine there. But we do not allow it when the crime is, say, first-degree murder. In that case, the penal consequences of the crime committed have to be met by the one guilty of the crime. We would consider it unjust if a substitute were to serve the punishment instead of fine, in place of the perpetrator. Cases of crimes where the penal consequences involved are pecuniary or monetary need not be trivial. They can be very serious crimes, such as large-scale fraud, which carry with them crippling financial consequences for the person convicted of that crime. In such circumstances, what is important is that the fine is paid, not that the perpetrator pays it. Someone generous enough might pay the full penalty on behalf of the fraudster if they had the financial wherewithal. The law would be satisfied, even though the perpetrator of the crime has not actually paid the penal consequence set out by the law. A substitute has done so instead. But importantly, we find no examples of legislation allowing substitution when the crime is a serious felony, such as murder. In such cases, the one guilty must meet the penal consequences of that crime, and we would consider it a terrible miscarriage of justice were a substitute punished in place of the perpetrator. Okay.
Dude, that's so good.
I know, right?
All right, so let me just lay this out, and you correct me if I'm wrong, because
Okay.
I'm the person listening. So I
Yeah.
think my mind's fresh to this. So basically, what they're saying is, if I steal money from you, anybody can pay the fine back as long as the money gets returned. Right?
Yeah.
My dad steps in, pays the fine, you get your money back. You're happy. Doesn't matter if I paid it or not. But if I
Yeah.
kill your son, or I kill your friend,
You can't give
my
my
dad,
son back.
Dad's not gonna
my
serve in
dad
jail.
can't serve my time.
Right.
Yeah.
My dad can't serve my time. I have to serve the time because I committed the crime.
There's no way to pay a certain amount of money back to get your son back.
No, you can't pay enough of the fine to get the son back. It has to be a punishment that goes beyond
Yeah.
punitary, whatever that word is, which is
Punitive.
money. Punitive. There you go, money, and then
Oh, pecuniary?
Pecuniary.
pecuniary.
Yeah.
It goes,
Did I read that wrong?
No, you did. You read it
Pecuniary?
right.
you read it right.
I kept saying
Trevor just
in
butchered it.
first.
That's
Oh, I
Pecuniary.
literally am like, I've never heard that word, but I know what it means. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
that thought process is brilliant because then it puts it to the case where like I did have immediate thoughts where I'm like, no, you can't like let someone else serve your time. Like you
Yeah.
see some Al Capone guy that's like, all right, let me get Jimmy in here. Jimmy, you're going to jail for me. We know that's wrong.
Mm-hmm. John.
John,
Oh, okay.
how do we
Yeah.
do this?
John,
Get us
what's
out
the
of this
transition
mess.
here?
Get us out of this mess. Where do we go?
You don't have to guess out of this mess. I just want to hear your thoughts, whether they're confusing or fully formed.
Yeah. So one thing I'm thinking is that is true with our criminals statutes. There are some crimes. In fact, there's some crimes where it's both. So, for example, a class, I think it's a class, don't quote me on this, but I think it's pretty close. Like a class, we have different classes of felonies and misdemeanors.
Yeah.
Class A being the most serious, Class E being the least serious of any felony. So, for example, a Class D felony, which might be something like involuntary manslaughter.
Yeah, accidentally hitting somebody with your car.
You could serve like up to, I think it's up like 5 years in the Department of Corrections, or you could pay a fine of up to like $5,000. Now, I may be off a little bit, but those are pretty close. And those get more serious as you go along. So even for Class A, even though it may not be murder, but it may be another serious crime, you could pay a high fine.
And get out.
And that would be all. The judge has the discretion to impose only fines. He has the discretion to impose only a jail time. And he has the discretion to impose both. The judge can do both. He can say, you got to serve this much time, and you got to pay this, which he would probably do if there's a financial damage that's been done to somebody. For example, if you hit somebody and they were injured and they had to go to the hospital and they spent $10,000 in medical bills, he may say, you got to pay those medical bills and you got to serve 2 years in the
or they're
Department
the
of Corrections.
breadwinner of the house too, like that they don't have that income's gone. And the judge is going like, this dad can never work again.
Now that system's come under a lot of criticism lately because particularly with municipal charges, that was all fines. And the problem was with it, there was that fell more disproportionately on poor people, particularly people of color.
Yep.
And so you had communities you had these folks that were under these heavy fines, they couldn't pay it.
Yep.
And it was a system that's been very criticized in Missouri. And there's been some recent statutes passed to alleviate that.
That's
quite
been
a
helping.
few.
Good.
Yeah. So where now instead of doing a fine, you can do community service. You can do other things to serve off your penalty, even in a municipal situation, as opposed to a fine. And then there's been limits to how much they can fine. There've been limits to how much the percentage of their budget a certain community can use to raise their funds through the criminal justice system.
So let me ask you this question. Let me ask you this question. So if you're taking this substitution idea that we've been breaking down, like each sin is $1.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like
it seems so silly, but yeah.
So example. Like you got 2,300,000,000, 12 sins.
12 kajillion.
Yeah, it's like
some real numbers.
And now you stand before God, and Jesus has got all the money in the world, so he just hands over the money. That's one way to see this. Okay, so like that's
I want to say you can. No, it wasn't on video. Our Good Friday service this year.
Yeah.
I led a good chunk of it, and then you gave the devotional message kind of thought.
Right.
And I remember hearing you give it and thinking, that's a pecuniary
It
atonement.
That propitiation was the word I was talking about, and that is that very idea of God substituting Christ's perfection for your imperfection, or substituting Him serving your sin, paying your fine, paying your cost.
Yeah.
Very
I remember
similar.
you had an idea about a check.
I did. And the idea was that a guy showed up in court, and I won't give the whole backstory, but he showed up in court. The judge was an old friend of his. The judge pronounced sentence because he was guilty. And then the judge took off his robe, went around, put his arm around the guy, took out his checkbook, and wrote the fine out. And it was a fine amount that this guy could have never paid.
Yeah.
And I think that's a beautiful example. I think it's a true example of the gospel, which is that Christ pays the penalty that we can never pay. Now, where I think, in that situation, you write the check and God pays the penalty and the guy walks free is sort of true, but I think what God does, and what I think is really cool, is instead of just letting you free, God takes his arm around you and takes you over to the adoption court and then adopts you.
Yeah.
So you're not just free, but you're part of his family.
Yeah.
So I think it's a different transaction also takes place in that not only are you set free, not just to go back to where you were, but you're put into a new family.
And the thought process I've had, and I think we talked about it right around that week too, is the difference between mercy and grace. Whereas mercy is the judge forgives the debt, right? Grace is the no, I'll go to prison for you.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like that's the difference between the two. So mercy is your debt's forgiven.
Right.
Grace is I will pay your debt.
Do you see any downfalls to thinking of the atonement in the pecuniary, the money sort of way, the debt sort of way?
Wow. I really hadn't thought about that, but let me just go off the top of my head, and then you can correct me.
I'm going to think about this for a second.
Yeah. So, and I see this in my practice, which is, okay, the judge imposes a fine on, little Junior who was going too fast and got a speeding ticket in Billings, and his fine is $250. Well, guess who pays that most of the time? It's grandma that pays that, or it's his dad or somebody. But I've had some parents come in and say, no, he's going to pay it. He's going to pay your fee. He's going to pay that fine. And I always respect that because I thought, well, that kid is going to learn a lesson
the
here.
full weight.
Yeah. So the problem may be with this is, I can do whatever I want because Christ has it covered.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a big problem.
Yeah. Then Paul addresses that, of course, in Romans chapter 6.
Shall we go on
Should I go on sinning?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, actually, he says, hell no. If you read it in the Greek.
I can't remember how the NIV says it, but it's that's
By no
basically
means.
The Greek has
Trevor
the asterisk.
translation.
Yeah.
The
By
Greek
no
has
means.
the asterisk between the first and last letter.
Yep.
So, yeah, that's the way I've seen that play out in Christianity in the Bible Belt, where we're at,
Yeah.
is ticket to heaven theology.
Mm-hmm.
I just need to do whatever I can to where somebody pronounces me saved,
Right.
and then I can never come back to church, never pray, never talk to God. I'm not worried about the scripture where God says, I never knew you, because I never knew him, but he saved me.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm going to heaven, I'm getting a mansion of my own, or whatever. And that sort of idea, it's the same as you saying grandma paid it and he didn't learn his lesson.
Yeah.
Like,
There's like so many thoughts that are coming into my
Yeah.
head. One thought that immediately popped into my head was how if you put somebody on their deathbed and they had regrets, how they would give everything they have to go back and do some things over and to change some things. And money becomes so much less than what it was. No matter how much you had or how little you had, you're like, I'd give everything I have. And there's something about this, just keeping it in that like financial side, that I don't feel like you feel the full weight of like what you've missed out on or what you are giving. But then there's another side of it that Jesus talks about money more than heaven and hell combined in his earthly ministry. And so there's something about money that has weight in our security, in our hearts, and what we think it provides for our future, what we think it provides for generations beyond us, where we can give generational wealth, that, there is some power in it that I think can't be forgotten. In poorer parts of the world, it may not be as big of a deal, or it may be a larger deal, where you're like, you get $100 fine and you make $1.50 a day. It's like, here, most fines, you can get line of credit, you can find a way to still move on. That you're in big trouble. The other thought I have with this, and this maybe just goes along with that, but in a book, The Insanity of God, which I absolutely love, and if you have not read it, it's one of my favorite. It talks about, is Jesus worth it? And he goes around a bunch of places and asks countries that are being persecuted. He writes a follow-up to that book called The Insanity of Obedience. And one of the big questions he asks at the very beginning is, what is holding back the people of God from being obedient? And one of the things he says about the American church, which may challenge us, is moms and dads that are not allowing their kids to pay the price of following Jesus.
Yeah.
They're not allowing them to be in situations that could be dangerous. They're not allowing them to move into situations that could be a little less secure or solid. They're not allowing them to follow the faith that they've been placed in. And to me, that feels like this in some ways, where we don't like the concept that I have to feel the weight of what it would be like to someone else to go to prison for me. That's the balance that Paul's putting in his letter, right? If someone's in prison because of your sins, not a bank account. If someone's hanging on a cross for what you did, not a money thing. The pain of that, the intensity of that, I think is the side of this that Paul's leaning on a little later in Romans, right? Where he's just kind of going like, you guys are treating this like the God of endless money can just keep paying your fines, and you realize it cost him in flesh and blood and body, and like that was deeply painful.
1 Corinthians 6 says you were bought with a price.
Yes.
So that price was Christ.
High.
Life itself. I think of Isaiah 53, which we looked at this morning, which is that not only did Christ didn't just get out his checkbook, which would be nothing for him because he has all the money and the cattle on 1,000 hills. but he was actually crushed. Why? For our inequity. So
Mm-hmm.
I think the idea that this theory has some real merit based upon a lot of scripture.
Yeah.
But I think the danger is, I had a friend who's no longer with us now, but Dave Hickleb, some people know him, very godly man, but he always talked about cheap grace. And it really troubled him.
Yeah.
How this idea of just, raising your hand at a revival or walking down and signing a piece of paper or, saying the sinner's prayer, and then you go back to your life as it always was, and there's really no change.
Yeah.
Really, really bothered him, and it should bother him. Should bother us.
Yeah.
Any man is in Christ, he's a new creation. So is the idea, I liked R.C. Sproul, he used to say, a true Christian is not somebody who just professes Christ, but also possesses Christ. It's both the profession and the possession.
Absolutely.
You got to possess it, and how do you know you possess it? It's based on your fruits, it's based on your life and how you live. So,
And I think to kind of tie this all up, and Ryan, I'll give you a chance to say some thoughts if you have them, but to tie this all up, I think there's a power in this that helps you see the weight of your sin, whether it's a financial burden of a number beyond which you could ever pay.
Right.
And then I think it's also important to see the depths of what God has done to rescue you, in the sense of the sacrifice of the physical side of what he chose to do, where it's like, if you're going, I always think of it in, golly, what can I not remember his name right now, but Bonhoeffer, when he decided to go against Germany and he knew it was going to cost his life. And he's looking at this going like, no, this is what Jesus did for me, and I will do that for others if that's what it'll take. When you talk about it coming out of you, I think that's when you feel the full weight, is when you're willing to sacrifice, when you're willing to do hard things, when you're willing to see that you've been given this gift. It just flows out of you. I pray with my kids every night to be generous with their time, with their energy, and with their money. And it's because I should say every night, when I pray with them, most nights. But I think there's an intensity of that I want that. I want to be generous to the point that it hurts, to the point it makes me uncomfortable, to the point that I'm like, gosh, that's what this atonement is in my mind. It's God's over generosity to the point of death of himself.
So,
Ryan, closing thoughts.
there's a few loose threads I want to tie up.
Yeah.
Because we don't have another half hour to just talk about this. One of the other things I thought was objectionable about thinking about the money sort of side of this legal view of the atonement is that Jesus is more valuable than money. You're saying it's really easy to give up money. And that's coming from us, from rich Westerners versus like the widow with the 2 coins. It's a lot harder for her to give up money. But for us, it's really easy for us to give up money. And Jesus is worth more than, for us, digital numbers on the internet wherever our bank is, or pieces of paper or gold coins or whatever.
Yeah.
Jesus' life is more valuable than that. He's not inanimate. But the problem that he was trying to throw up there in that was that it seems unjust for a person to serve a punishment like jail time or death for another person. I don't think this is a perfect answer. And he kind of ties up in the book too, not the same way. But why is it unjust for a person to serve the punishment for another person? Well, 2 reasons. One, on earth, when we do law, if you let that person out, let somebody else serve their punishment and let them stay out. You talked about Al Capone and one of his gangsters. If Al Capone lets one of his gangsters substitute for him, he's still out there. He's a danger to the community. When God is judging, there is no danger to the community. You are in his community, safe, thriving, or you're not. And there's no other community other than
You're
suffering
restored.
maybe for a little bit. That'll
Yeah.
be another episode. It's
You're rough. Yeah, no, you're right.
annihilationism and
You're
internal
you're-
constorment.
But I think it's true that
There's no danger to the outside community when God is judging you in that way. Second thing, it's unjust to the person who lost something because they're no longer getting that thing back. They're not getting the punishment of the offending party. When you sin, you're offending 2 parties, whoever you're directly affecting and God. And I think God being the judge and the offended party is fine. If he's willing to substitute himself for you, then he's willing to let somebody substitute themselves for you.
So if you weren't going against God in a sin, just another
Yeah.
human, he wouldn't be allowed to be substituted. But because it offends him as well, he's a part of the party that's allowed to forgive
Yeah.
or allowed to let that.
And the other part of the party,
Makes
the
sense.
people,
Mm-hmm.
again, those people are either going to be perfectly healed and restored and not needing anything because they're in God's presence with him in eternity, or they're not. And then they're not.
And the other side, and this isn't, we don't have time for this, Ryan, but
Yeah.
you and I know this, and John and I know this. None of us are innocent.
Yeah.
So
What-
if two,
yeah,
if two guilty
yeah.
parties on our either side of
Yeah.
each other yelling back and forth over the same issues or the same weight,
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
it changes the whole thing, right? There's no defendant, there's no innocent party, there's no guilty party in this plan. It's all
Yeah.
are guilty.
Yeah. So to point to the next episode, is Jesus' atoning death a payment of a debt or a serving of a punishment? If the debt is money, then it doesn't make sense. But if the debt is blood, like a sacrifice,
Yep.
ooh, that's how
Yeah.
we get to the next one. If the debt is blood,
Yeah.
then his
May-
sacrifice paid that debt.
Perfectly.
And we'll get to it on the next episode of the King's
Hey,
Way.
thanks, John, so much for being here.
Enjoyed it.
And I think this is an awesome discussion. Do not let this be the end place. We'll make sure to put that book in the link.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll even find, we'll try to link back or put a link to the other atonement thing if you want to go back and listen to that
Yeah.
episode 50.
Yeah.
That'd be, it's a good
I like
one.
that. That
I
was
really
a
enjoy
really
it.
good episode.
Make sure to turn on the subscribe button, hit the notifications, hit the like if you liked this video, you want to see more. And that way you won't miss next week's video either when that comes out.
We're also gathering Q&A questions.
Yep.
I don't know if we have any right now.
We need to get some. People.
Please, if you're thinking somebody else is going to send in questions and I'll listen to them answer those questions, that someone is you. You need to send us questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, we just want a few, and part of it is because we have personal, discussions and conversations with people, and they say, we wish, but then we don't get any Q&A, so we're like, hey, come on, like send
Yeah.
it in. If you care enough to write it in, we'll care enough to talk about it.
Yeah.
So
Just so you know, every Q&A question in the coffer rings a soul from purgatory springs.
Wait a minute, I thought we didn't believe that.
it's too soon, man. Too
Too
soon.
Man, it's only 500 years ago. It's way too soon.
Thanks so much for watching today. Have a great and glorious day in the Lord. We'll see you later.
See ya.